the years passed and Jesus did not return, the imminency of the second coming was emphasized less, and other, more immediate concerns began to demand the attention of the Christian leadership. The first major concern for the growing church was the question of the Gentiles, that is, non-Israelites. Initially, Christianity was an exclusively Jewish sect. Every Christian was a practicing Jew, they just happened to believe in a few extra things that were not believed by mainstream Judaism. But as the first generation of disciples went out into the wider Greco-Roman world, they often found willing non-Jewish adherents. So, are they allowed to be Christian, or what? Some Christian leaders said yes, and others said no. As you probably already know, though, the drive to allow for Gentile conversion was driven by St. Paul, and his point of view eventually won out. Traditionally, the first Gentile Christian was a centurion named Cornelius, who was baptized by St. Peter himself, though that is one of those myriad little controversies that I am not going to wade into. The question of whether Christianity should retain its strictly Jewish character was answered early in the negative, but that question was merely the opening salvo in a long-running Christian debate about the nature of their religion. That is, whether the church ought to be composed of a select few who were pure in their faith and utterly devoted in life, or whether it should make a play at becoming the universal religion of the world, which would inevitably involve clearing away most of the barriers to entry into the church. At the very beginning, it was understood that you had to be circumcised in order to be a true Christian, but that barrier was quickly dropped to allow for Gentile adherence. What other barriers should be dropped? What barriers could not be dropped? Though that initial question was resolved, the tension between big tent and small tent Christians would never go away, and every generation some new controversy would flare up that pitted purists against expansionists. The second century saw the passing away of the original disciples and gospel writers, and the rise of an independent Christianity with its own hierarchy of command, separate from all other religions in the empire. Up until the Great Jewish Revolt, Jerusalem had naturally acted as the de facto capital of Christianity, since it was, after all, a Jewish sect. But after Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, the church began to separate itself permanently from Judaism, culminating most visibly in the Christian refusal to join in the Third Jewish War of the 130s AD. The Romans themselves by that point had already determined the two religions were separate, and a tax edict issued by Nerva explicitly denies to Christians the special exemptions enjoyed by the Jews. See, the Romans liked people to get on board with the Roman way of doing things, and the Jews had always given them trouble on that front. But the Romans were also deeply impressed with the sheer ancientness of Judaism, and so, more or less, let the Jews conform to Roman rule in their own way. But the Christians were recognized as a newfangled thing, owed no such deference. Jesus' church, which had once been just a little sect of Judaism, was now, for better or for worse, its own independent thing. The other major consequence of the sack of Jerusalem is that the Christian movement also became far more decentralized. With Jerusalem out of the picture, the local leadership of each of the Christian centers now took command of their parishes and ran them as they saw fit. Ironically, though, just as the church as a whole was becoming less centralized, the chain of command at the local level was becoming more centralized. Over the years, the Christians developed a system whereby each city had its own chain of authority, with deacons at the lowest rung doing the daily work of tending to the sick and poor, the next run of presbyters, who would become today's priests, acting as a sort of governing council, and at the top the bishop, who was the supreme religious authority in his district, which usually meant that he issued clarifications on the differences between a true and a false teaching. Naturally, the bishops of the largest cities, Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria, came to exert an extra bit of authority over their surrounding territories, and the Bishop of Rome in particular claimed a higher authority even than that, both because he sat in the capital of the empire, and because his seat had been founded by St. Peter himself. But if you'd like to enjoy an entertaining conniption fit, just ask the Bishop of Alexandria what he thinks about the primacy of Peter. Since the main role of the bishop was to establish the difference between what was a true and what was a false teaching, we must ask the question then, what happened when the bishops disagreed with each other? And that, my friends, is the $10,000 question of early Christian history. The church was not some sort of hive mind, and the various bishops disagreed with each other frequently, passionately, and sometimes violently about almost everything under the sun. And these were serious disagreements. This was not, I think what that guy over there is teaching is true, and you think what that guy, I think what I am teaching is true, and I think that what you are teaching is false. Excommunications and counter-excommunications began to proliferate, and sometimes succession to a major bishopric began to look like succession to the imperial throne, with supporters of the new bishop purging supporters of the old bishop, stripping them of their priesthoods and kicking them out of the church, only to have the whole drama play out in reverse a few years later. It is truly a wonder that Christianity managed to maintain any sort of cohesion at all during this period. But enough of the bishops had enough of an interest in preventing a major schism that they would meet in councils, summits really, and hash out their differences, force each other to compromise, and try to put these controversies to rest. But just as one issue was put to bed, another would pop up, threatening a split all over again. And we haven't even gotten to the really big controversies of the 3rd and 4th centuries yet. The 3rd century was as tumultuous for the Christians as it was for everyone else. Though Christianity had always been an outlaw religion, and had found itself the victim of periodic local persecutions, in Rome under Nero, in Gaul during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, and so on, imperial policy rarely took notice of them. Trajan's advice to Pliny that he ought to ignore the Christians unless they did something really wrong seemed to be standard operating procedure. But as the empire fell into chaos, the Christians for the first time felt the sting of coordinated imperial attack. Maximinus Thrax ordered the first major attack on Christianity, though he limited the scope of his persecutions to the bishops. 15 years later, attempting to get Rome back on the right side of the gods, Decius broadened the scope of persecution to include all Christians, which not only resulted in confiscations and executions across the empire, but also a major split within the church between leaders who advocated compliance and those, particularly in North Africa, who advocated resistance. The latter would eventually be shouted down and declared heretical when the Decian persecutions was over. But this episode foreshadowed the later, larger fight with the Donatists, who advocated similar resistance to Diocletian's persecutions, or more accurately, resistance to those who acquiesced to them. But just as it seemed like things were going from bad to worse for the Christians, the empire was falling apart, and the emperors were now specifically targeting them for harassment, Christianity suddenly enjoyed an unprecedented run of growth and acceptance. Gallienus canceled the Decian persecution on the grounds that it was unnecessary and unjust, and the Illyrian emperors had way more important things on their minds. So from 260 until about 300, the stigma attached to Christianity was muted. So much so that the religion that had once been derided as a religion of women and slaves now counted amongst its number wealthy and influential men. Slaves were now joined by their masters, wives were now joined by their husbands, common soldiers by their officers, the poor by the rich. Churches ceased to be little hovels hidden away deep in the maze of an inner city, and were now being built right out in the open. By 300 AD, in fact, a church sat on a hill in Nicomedia overlooking the imperial palace. Christians were still in the minority by a substantial margin across the empire, but they were estimated by this point to account for about 10% of the population, which was nothing to sneeze at. Over the course of the past 3 centuries, the little sect of heretical Jews led by a messianic holy man from Nazareth had grown to be the largest monotheistic religion in the empire and a social force with real teeth, which is, perhaps, what troubled Diocletian's advisors the most. Of all the myriad differences between Christians and pagans, perhaps no single difference loomed larger in the minds of imperial authorities than just how structured Christianity was. Yes, the church functioned politically more as a loose oligarchy of bishops than as some unified autocracy, but still, no pagan cult could come close to matching the empire-wide network of institutionalized authority that Christianity boasted. It was nothing less than a parallel command structure to the state, and if you listened to Christian rhetoric for any length of time, you would find that most of them believed that their command structure actually superseded the state's, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, notwithstanding. The fact that roughly 10% of the population was now Christian and adhered to that command structure scared the hell out of many in the government. Plus, that 90-10 split is a bit misleading, because Christianity was still clustered in the cities at this point, so their minority share seemed that much larger to government officials living in those same cities. Coupled with genuine fears of organized revolution, there was also the fact that the church was beginning to raise funds in unprecedented sums, as wealthy patrons began to render unto God whatever they weren't rendering unto Caesar. So when we ask the question, why were Diocletian's advisors so keen on taking the Christians out? The answer essentially boils down to protection of the status quo. They were amongst the greatest beneficiaries of it, and the Christians were amongst the greatest threats to it. So, this is all mostly a case of entrenched power making a preemptive strike against a potential rival. But following the initial purge of the imperial household and the army, tempers cooled some. The purge of the army was in fact unevenly enforced at best. And it wasn't until the winter of 302-303 that things really got rolling again. Not that Diocletian hadn't been gearing up for the fight in the meantime. In 301 he had visited Egypt and encountered problems with the Manichaeans, a religion similar to Christianity both in substance and organization, which had become a hotbed for resistance to imperial authority. Diocletian was additionally troubled by the Manichaeans because their religion originated in Persia, and members still had close ties to their brethren Diocletian, a lot like a Sassanid-aligned fifth column. So the Manichaeans were ruthlessly suppressed. Executions, exiles, confiscations, and destruction of scripture. In effect, a dry run for the great persecution of Christians that was coming down the chute. Diocletian and Galerius were in Nicomedia over the winter of 302-303 when things finally got going. The emperors had attempted to get a pronouncement on something or other from an oracle of Apollo, but the oracle instead announced that the, quote, impious on earth were preventing him from connecting with the gods. Diocletian huddled with his council to determine what this meant, and they were of one mind. It meant that the gods were angry at Rome for tolerating the Christians. I should mention at this point that it is widely believed that by now, Galerius was taking more of a lead in imperial policy, and as a fierce anti-Christian, that he was actually the driving force behind all of this. At its most all-encompassing, the blame Galerius for everything theory contends that the junior emperor arranged